Going. Wow, that was a real good start. Going into the preseason, Riot said that they wanted to buff ADCs by making crit itemization smoother and have giving them more agency over the game. But if you look at preseason win rates, that's a massive lie. It just did not work. Where did they go wrong? This video will be a deep dive into the gold values and efficiencies of ADC itemization, and it will look at just where Riot broke the rule. Before we get into that though, I want to go over how we are going to be doing our analysis. We're going to be using the concept of gold values and gold efficiency. Basically, what that means is that most stats in League have a value and a cost that we can define and then use in other places. For example, you can get the value of AD or attack damage as 35 gold per point by taking the value of a longsword. It costs 350 gold but gives you 10 AD. So that gives you 1 AD is worth 35 gold. You can extrapolate this basically to the entirety of League for almost every stat. However, there are a few cases where that breaks down and a few cases where I want to point them out right now. For example, right here we see old crit and new crit. Old crit, I gave the value of 40 gold because that's how much gold Cloak of Agility or a crit cloak gave to the value of crit. However, the value of crit did not technically change by that metric in the preseason, but what did change is the amount of power that crit gives you. Basically, in the old system, one crit was worth an additional 100% damage on your auto attack, basically taking from 100% damage to 200% damage. However, in the preseason, part of where Riot changed things is they made it go from 100% damage to 175% damage, or losing that 25% damage. And so the reason that I value the new crit less is because it gives you 25% less power off the bat. Another place that I'd like to point out is old IE versus new IE. The Infinity Edge in both systems has a crit scaler on it. In the old system, it was a 25% increase to that 100% bonus damage. In the new system, it's an 8 to a 40% increase over the 75% bonus damage that we have. And so that's why I actually have two different values of IE's passive. It gives 3.2 gold for per point of crit when you only have 20 crit, but it actually gives 16% or 16 gold worth of stats when you have 40% crit. The way I defined that is I took how much does the IE passive increase 1 point worth of critical strike by the amount of damage increase it will give you. And I found that, for example, old IE increases the 40 gold by 25%, giving you 10 extra gold per point of crit. The new IE, when you have 40%, increases that same 30 gold by 16 gold, increasing it by a lot. Another few examples that are a little bit more esoteric, I defined base sheen and bonus sheen separately. The reason is that in the new system, sheen itself is an item that only gives the sheen effect, so it's really easy to get that gold value. The bonus AD sheen, on the other hand, is a little, like, it's not directly defined at all in the system, but I theorize that it's probably worth more than the base AD because it scales. So I defined it, just randomly picked a number at 1,000 gold, said it's a third more valuable than base AD of the same amount, mostly because you can get more bonus AD than you can get base AD in almost every case. So that it was a decision. There is nowhere in the game that I took that from. That was just a decision that I defined the value of a 1.0 bonus AD scaling on Sheen as 1,000 gold worth. Another thing where I also defined it is in the new system and the old system, CDR and haste technically have the same gold value if you look at them by lowest denomination of items. However, haste mathematically is worth less than CDR in every case because of how CDR and haste works. CDR is a percent decrease of how long your abilities take to cast, ability haste is a percent increase in the cadence of your abilities. So for example, 100% ability haste means that you cast twice as often, or you have 50% CDR. So, but on the other hand, 10% more ability haste is about equal to 10% CDR, because casting about 10% more times is roughly equivalent mathematically to taking 10% less time to cast. The thing is that ability haste doesn't scale as fast. It's not an exponential growth in your ability cadence, which is why I said that it should be worth a little bit less. Now that we have that out of the way, I want to go through and actually look at each individual item and the changes that they had to just kind of see what happened. What changed? The first one I have listed here is Infinity Edge. So basically, they took away 10 AD, they took away 5% crit chance, they added the differential crit amp that I went over a minute ago, and they didn't change any gold. So basically, if you look at the gold value when you just have IE, you lost nearly 1,000 gold worth of stats, which is insane. And moving on to when you get 100% crit chance, it gets a lot better, but it's still not perfect. You go from 950 gold down to only 150 gold down, but it's still a fairly sizable loss. Moving on to Essence Reaver, which I think is honestly the biggest winner of this entire item set. Maybe not, I think it might be the biggest winner. On the surface though, it loses 30 gold, which is very valuable. That's a lot of gold value just inherently lost with AD. Also, as every crit item did of the major crit items, it loses 5% crit chance. But it gains a sheen effect. Oh, that's supposed to be this, so you can see that it's 0.4. But it gains a sheen effect that is 1.0 base AD scaling and 0.4 bonus AD scaling for every 1.5 seconds on ability. That is worth a lot of fucking gold. And then it also loses value here because of the difference between CDR and haste. But it loses 400 gold worth of cost. So it costs 400 less, and it loses about 400 gold's worth of stats. But in my opinion, that's actually like an increase, because the relative percentages is actually higher. In most cases, especially in the new item set, you are relatively okay with losing 1-to-1 cost to value. Moving on to Stormrazor, you can see it also loses 10 AD. It is parity on attack speed. It loses the same 5% crit, has the same energized passive, but now it costs 500 less. So this isn't perfect because you're losing 750 gold worth of value and only losing 500 gold of cost. So it's technically a worse item, but yeah, it's technically a worse item that just gives you less AD, which is not great, and less crit. Runaan's, on the other hand, is the biggest outlier I found in terms of gold value. So in the old stat, it gave you 40 attack speed, 25% crit. It had the two bolts that both did 0.4 of your AD ratio on them, and it also gave 7% MS. If you ignore the bolts completely, it was not a stat efficient item at all. It was considerably lower. However, the way you can mathematically figure out the bolts is questionable, or at least the way I did it. I considered that the 0.4 AD ratio can kind of be considered an on-hit effect, right? Kind of, sort of. So what I did is I took 2 times the value of an 0.4 AD's worth of on-hit damage because it hits twice. It doesn't hit your main target, but it does hit twice. So I assumed that with this item, most ADCs that have this item at minimum will have around 110 AD. However, at maximum, they'll probably have around 300 AD. So if you take those on-hit effects into account, Runaan's is like the most broken item in the game, which is just not right. Well, maybe it is right, maybe that's what this finds. But there are definitely other ways that you could value this, but this is the way I chose to value this. Also, hey Kat, thanks for hopping into my video. Hey, it's Kat. And it gets even worse, or like more extreme, once you get into the new reworked version. So the new reworked version gives you 25 AD as well. But, Kat, I'm just gonna move you. Sorry, Kat. You're going over here for now. But so the new, please no, Kat. The new version, on the other hand, scales the AD up to 0.7. So using the same AD breakpoints, the value of Runons, if you count both on hits, is ridiculous. It, by my accounting, it's 13,000 gold's worth of stats. That's absurd. That's like the most broken item in the game by far. Like, that's absurd. Like, absolutely absurd. So, I really question if this is like the correct way to value this item, but that's what I did for this, so here we go. PD, on the other hand, the biggest issue is that I am unsure how to value a shield, so I didn't even try. I was just not sure at all. But the thing here is that it actually gains stats. This is one of the first times, besides this AD here, that somebody actually gains statistics. So that's cool. It gains 10% attack speed. And then once it is stacked, you gain another 40% attack speed. Basically, PD loses 300 gold worth in cost, or like it gains 300 gold worth in cost. It's 300 gold more expensive. But at the same time, when it's fully procced, if you don't count the shield, it is way more efficient. Counting the shield is difficult. Okay, RFC is a very, very, very similar item. It gains 100 gold worth of cost, gains 5 attack speed. Why the... Oh, but it also loses the crit. That's where this gold value drop comes in. So overall, this is a worse item in general. Okay, Mortar Reminder is where we start getting into the more interesting items. It is one of the items that Riot took in their more streamlined build philosophy that did not have crit in the past, and they added crit now. And so basically, they lose 25% AD, or 25 AD for this. You gain 25 attack speed, which was not there before. You also gain 20% crit, but you lose the pen. You lose the armor pen on this item. The Grievous is the same, although technically it is stronger because now it goes from 40 to 60% in some cases. So I probably could have increased the value by 50% to kind of match those. I didn't. But what you'll find is that this one was, and they also reduced the cost by 100. Hey, Cat. But what you'll find is that it went from an efficient item to a non-efficient item in this case. So overall, this item got worse, but it does build from crit, so like it does technically fill into your build path, so that's good. Okay, now we're on to the 3 mythic items of the new set. The first one that I have here is Gale Force. It gives 55 AD, 20% attack speed, 20% crit. It has a dash that does 180 to 315 damage base, plus a 0.45% bonus AD scaling. Not counting the active, this item is almost efficient. With the active, I'm sure it is. Kraken, on the other hand, has 5% or 5 more AD than Gale Force, and also 5% more attack speed. However, in this case, the mythic ability that makes it unique is that you do 60 plus 0.4% bonus AD true damage on every third hit. However, one thing to note with this item is that it does not interact with the tri-hit passive of Ginsu's on range champions. So you cannot build this and Ginsu's and then have a faster cadence of this true damage. Unfortunately, Riot explicitly coded that in, explicitly coded that out. However, they left it for melee champions because reasons. Sure. Okay, moving on to Shield Bow. Shield Bow is the item that a lot of people are buying right now. It gives you less AD than either of the other ones, less attack speed as well, same crit, but where it's unique is that it's the defensive mythic. It gives you 12% lifesteal, it gives you a fairly large shield that's basically ripped from Phantom Dancer except slightly stronger, and when you proc the shield, you also get an additional 15% lifesteal. This item gives you 27% lifesteal by itself when you have proc your shield. That's fairly powerful. That's a lot of lifesteal. And so without it being procced and not counting the shield, it is almost gold efficient. Once it's procced, again, not counting the shield even, it is gold efficient with this lifesteal proc. Okay, moving on to Lord Dominiks' Regard. This is another one of those items where Riot is like, hey, this is an item that's mostly bought by marksmen. Let's shift it into the crit interactions. Give it crit, alter it a little bit to make sense, ship it. So what they did is they took away 15 AD, they added 20 crit, they removed 10% pen from it. You can no longer get 35% pen as a marksman, except to use Cyrilda's, which is not a crit item, so I'm not talking about it right now. And they added the damage amp when people are larger HP than you. They added that back in. And so it's a 0 to 15% damage amp, which can be sizable when there's a lot of HP stackers. However, this is another stat that I really wasn't sure how to mathematically value, so I just left it blank. And so the old LDR was slightly more than gold efficient, and the current one, not counting the damage amp, is slightly less than gold efficient. However, personal opinion, I believe that a 0 to 15% damage amp is worth more than this 300 gold. So this item probably got a buff. However, the problem is that it also lost AD and became less generically useful. And now it gains value against higher HP targets, but loses value against lower HP targets. Okay, now we're on to Collector. Collector has 55 AD, 20 crit, and the interesting part about this is it is a lethality crit item that also has an execute passive where every time you hit something that will end up below 5% HP, it dies. It takes true damage till death, which is honestly a really, really cool effect, and props to Riot for this item. I love it. And also, on champion kill, it gives you 25 gold. The gold value for this item as well is fairly hard to calculate. You can do 80 crit lethality, you can do all of those stats, but once you get onto the execute effect, how much is an execute effect worth? That's like a really hard question that I didn't know how to answer. Similarly, how much is a gold on kill effect worth? You can vary how many champion kills you get a lot. For example, like one game you're popping off, you might have 10 to 15 after this item. In that case, it's worth 250, 400 gold. That's pretty large. However, you might get this second item and get one kill. Then it's worth 25. So giving gold value to that effect is frankly kind of difficult. I could take, or like you could take the average case and just see how much or how many kills do people get on average after they get this item and use that value. But that requires a lot of statistics that I don't have, but that would be the best way I think of to value that stat. And so without the execute or the gold on kill taken in, this item is not gold efficient. Navori Quickblades is one of the most interesting new items. It's all Shojin. Basically, it gives 60 AD, which surprisingly, 60 AD is like one of the highest AD values in the entire new crit item system. The only thing that's higher is the new mythic and also IE that's 70. But you can't really buy IE until much later in the game because of how its passive works, and it's just not really that gold efficient before that passive. So Navori Quickblades is the second highest AD item that you can buy in this system, and it's only 60. That leads into some of the problems that I'll talk about a little bit later, but yeah. moving back to Navari Quick Blades, it's 60 AD, 20 crit, 30 haste, which is huge. Out the gate, this gives like 20-25% CDR if this is your only haste item. And then again, going back to Shojin, it gives you 20% CDR on your basic abilities on critical strike. So this scales with how much crit you have. But again, this is a stat that's really difficult to value, partly because for one, it depends on how much crit you have. For two, it kind of depends on per champion a little bit in the same way that CDR does per champion, but we can kind of throw that out, so I guess that doesn't mean anything. But it's difficult to value because it's only CDR on basic abilities, and it's also an on-hit CDR. So if somebody has a good way to mathematically value that, please let me know. I would love it. But this item's amazing. Even without the CDR on crit, it is efficient. That's absurd. Not even counting the biggest draw to the item, it's already efficient. This item is underbought. Okay, so Mercurial. This is another one in the list of items that Riot made crit specific, AD specific. It loses 20 AD, gains the 20 crit, loses the lifesteal, loses MR, keeps the same QSS passive, and also loses 500 gold. So here we're losing 550 gold worth of stats and losing about 500 gold worth of value. So relative parity, honestly, this item's okay. I dislike that they removed the lifesteal from it because I think the lifesteal was very valuable on the item in the past because it made it more of a one-size-fits-all defensive item. Because it gives you MR versus mages, it gives you the QSS passive to get out of CC, and it also gave you lifesteal to kind of like sustain up after you got hit by the CC. However, now the item works fairly differently. You have 20% or 20 less AD, which means it's a lot less of an offensive item even. You also, like, you do gain 20% crit, which is valuable, but at the cost of 20 AD, it's a toss-up whether that's worth or not. And also you lose 5 MR and you lose the entirety of the lifesteal. This is a much lesser item, but granted it does cost less. So Bloodthirster. This is was one of my favorite items in the old set. I used to really like going IE, Essence Reaver, and Bloodthirster together on Draven and just popping off because you do so much damage. But in the new set, it loses 25 AD. That's an insane loss of AD. However, it does give you 20% crit, which again is valuable. It keeps the same lifesteal, unlike Mercurial, so you don't lose out on lifesteal compared to the old system. Gives you the same shield, which again, I did not give a gold value to because I'm not sure how to do that. But yeah, it loses 100 gold, loses 275 gold worth of stats. The problem lies in this item. Again, it lost a shit ton of AD. Okay, I'm gonna actually take Ginsu's last, so I'm gonna go AD or GA real quick. GA is the exact same item. It has 40 AD, 40 armor, the GA passive. Still good. Okay, Ginsu's. Ginsu's is the most reworked item, in my opinion, between old set and new set. So what changed is that it no longer has AD. It gives a lot more of attack speed, 25 to 40. It no longer has the percent pen on it. The old Ginsu's you had to stack up 6 times before you got the 3-hit passive, and every auto gave you, I believe it was 8% attack speed. Yeah, so 8 times 6, 48. And then once you got full stacks, you got the 3-hit passive called Ginsu's Rage. In the new one, on the other hand, doesn't give AD. It gives more attack speed out the gate. And so I'll get to why I have no crit listed here for the reason that Ginsu's passive converts crit to AD or physical on hit damage at the realm of 20% crit to 40 on hit damage. So rather than double count and give it critical strike and the on hit damage, I chose to count it as a 0 crit item that has 40 on hit base. And again, no percent pen. And so the reason I have it like this is that if you buy Ginsu's by itself, it is only worth 2,000 gold. This is counting the attack speed. This is counting the on hit from its own critical strike chance. And yeah, that's it. I am unsure how to quantify the rage passive because I could theoretically like increase the value of on hits by a third, but that doesn't count the synergy with on hits that you already have. So that's kind of questionable. So both sides here, this and this, all three of these technically should have the value of Ginsu's Rage on top of what they actually have. However, the value of Ginsu's when you have 100% crit, I calculated a little bit differently than most people do. Most people, when I see them give gold values to this item, are double counting the value of crit and the on hit on the item. They are counting the on hit that you get from Ginsu's as well as keeping the value of the critical strike chance on the other item. Again, double counting. The way I did it, on the other hand, is I gave the value of the in total of the on hit that you would get, which is 200, but I also subtracted the value of the critical strike of the other items that you would have had to get there. This way I can keep the other items separate and only count the difference in value on the Ginsu's itself. So when you have 100% crit and Ginsu's, it's still only a 3,600 gold item plus the value of Ginsu's Rage. Ginsu's Rage is probably a very valuable passive because even look here, if I increase this by 1.33, how much does this go? This goes all the way up to 5,300, only counting the value of Ginsu's Rage on its own passive. That doesn't count any synergy with anything else, but it raises it that high. Say you have Vayne's Silver Volts. Giving value to Vayne's Silver Volts effect is difficult as well, but you increase that by a third. And then any other unhit items. Ginsu's Rage and Ginsu's Rage Blade can get kind of absurd very, very quickly. The final item I'd like to go over is Death's Dance, which again wasn't a crit item, and they didn't make it a crit item, but it was a staple in a lot of ADC's builds in the old system. Before, it had 50 AD, 15% lifesteal or physical vamp, 30 armor MR, and 10 CDR. This item was basically everything an ADC could ever want to not get one shot and to be able to survive a fight. It also had the bleed effect, but it was only 10% on ADCs, and in my opinion it was fairly negligible and wasn't really at all the reason that ADCs would buy this item. ADCs would buy this item because it was a reasonable AD effect, it gave them lifesteal, and it gave them resistances and CDR that allowed them to survive burst and survive and thrive in a fight once they had damage from other sources. In the current system, however, gives the same AD, but it loses 30 MR, it gains 10 armor, but it gains 5 ability haste. The problem though is that losing 30 MR makes this item far more niche than it is, or than it was, which is a problem. Okay, so now that we've finished all the items and the gold values, etc., let's move on to a couple builds. So one of the most iconic builds in the old system was IE RFC Death's Dance, because it gave you a very good mix of damage, range, and survivability that is hard to match. Basically, it gave you these statistics, and it cost 10,700 gold to buy, and it gave you a bit over 12,000 gold worth of value. In total, that's around 130 AD, 65 attack speed, 50% crit chance with the modifier from IE, 30 armor and MR, and then 15% lifesteal. Trying to kind of match that in the new system, you could, for example, build Shield Bow, RFC Bloodthirster, and then also Zerkers. Here you're spending almost exactly the same amount of gold, but you're getting a lot less stats. You're getting 105 AD, 85 attack speed, 60% crit without the modifier, 32% lifesteal, and shields. So you're losing a lot of AD, you're gaining a little bit of attack speed, but most ADCs already have some form of attack speed steroid in their kit, so attack speed is inherently less useful. For example, Draven W, you have Tristana Q, you have a lot of things like that where you already inherently get a massive attack speed steroid in your kit. And so just generically, this build does a lot less damage. You might be a little bit more tanky, although the armor and MR difference, I feel like would kind of negate that. Okay, so let's look at the next build that might do it. This one's more of an on-hit variant that has a little bit less survivability. You get 65 AD from Kraken Slayer, 25 attack speed. You get either 40 or 80 attack speed from PD. Let's be nice and just say it's 80. Runon's gives you 25 AD and 40 attack speed. So in total, this gives you what? That's 90. So 90 AD, and then you have 80, 105, 145 plus 35 is 180 attack speed. That's not 1800. It's supposed to be 180. Close enough. So it gives you those as offensive stats, which this attack speed is kind of insane, but a lot of the cases you'll get 40 less, which puts this to 140, which is still a lot. But remember, ADCs most of the time value attack speed less than they value AD. And this build has no AD. Granted, it is designed to be the more on-hit to scale the Kraken Slayer, the PD, and the Runon applies to AoE. You might be able to add like a Bork or something to the end of this. Also, you could add a Ginsu's somewhere in here, which would make it kind of useful. But it's much harder to get AD in the current system. For example, if you go through to the items, i.e. the quintessential high AD item loses 10, Essence Reaver loses 30, Storm Razor loses 10, Runon's gains 25, which is something, PD and RFC, Mortal Reminder, which slotted into a lot of ADC builds, loses 25. Gale Force, all of the mythic items are substantially lower than the old rush items would be. You get attack speed at the same time, but you can't get the AD values. Like, compare this to IE Rush, Essence Reaver Rush, even fucking Bloodthirster Rush. You lose 25 AD or 15 AD. You lose a lot of AD when you go these items. LDR, you lose 15. Collector is also only 55, which is still fairly low in the old system, but is very high in the new system. Novari Quickblades, 60. Again, kind of low as an ADC, or as an AD item in the old system. Very, very high in the new system. Mercurial Scimitar also loses 20. Bloodthirster loses 25. Ginsu's loses 25. GA and Destans are null. There are more cases where you can buy attack speed in the current system, but there are far less sources of AD in the current system than there were than the old system, which leaves a lot of ADCs kind of struggling a bit, especially because in the old system, you could go 2, 3 crit items and be fine. 3 crit items gave you 75% crit, made your item or made your crits relatively consistent. But in the new system, you have to buy into crit more to make it valuable. Crit inherently gains value the more crit you have because it becomes way more consistent. 100% crit has no difference between the expected value and the max end value. Versus 20% crit, the expected value is fairly low. It's 20% of 75% damage amp. Versus the max value is a 75% damage amp. That variability is huge. And for example, 75% crit lowers that substantially, versus now to get a comparable value, you have to buy 4 crit items. And then that's boots, which only leaves you with 1 other item that you can get, which is a problem. Basically, ADCs, if they want to go the crit package, can only buy these items. Versus in the old system, you could buy things like Death's Dance. You could buy things like, for example, Sterak's, when they got it nerfed to melee only. ADCs were able to abuse Sterak's because they didn't have to buy so many crit items. The inherent problem with Riot's philosophy of requiring 20% crit on every item, so you are required to get 5 items if you want to get 100% crit, is that now it's way more difficult to buy other items, which to them might be a positive, but in the short term as a role, that's very much a negative because it reduces build diversity. It binds you much harder to the class, where if the class isn't good enough, you're just going to throw it out, which is kind of what's happening. Like, look at Jin. He buys Eclipse and then another lethality item. He doesn't go crit, and that's why he's one of the most successful ADCs. Every ADC has to choose between the crit package and everything else. If the crit package is not good, the crit package will never get bought. And that is a problem in the current system because earlier, in the old system, if a couple crit items are good, you can buy those couple crit items and then transition out. Versus now, every item that is in the crit package gives 20% crit. So you need 3 to 4 of them to make crits consistent, which means it's much, much, much harder to pick and choose other things that fit your build. Manamune, much harder, doesn't really fit in the crit package as much anymore. Black Cleaver, similar reasons. It hurts build diversity because it limits the crit items to just these. And you can go over these in 20 minutes. Versus in the old, like, I'm literally being a broken record here right now, guys. I apologize for that. It's just very aggravating when Riot wants to bind a class so hard to a small amount of items. It's it's a travesty as well, is because they made all the items much weaker. Crit does 25% less damage. Even with IE, it still does 10% less damage than it used to, even with 100% crit. And then it takes you much longer to scale up your crit because you have to get 5 items, or you have to buy crit cloaks. Like the current build on Yasuo Yone is you go Ginsu's into a couple crit cloaks. However, that build already got nerfed a while ago because things like Caitlyn were abusing it. And it's also not as viable because the crit cloaks only give you 15% crit on other champions, not Yasuo Yone. So to get a high crit rate early, you have to spend so much money and so many item slots to get a high percent crit rate, which is where the ADC role thrives. They don't even scale as well right now. Like, for example, every item, as I showed you, except Runon's, has less AD than its old set. You cannot get as high AD values if you stick within the crit package as you could before. Not by a lot. And you can get more attack speed, but that's not perfect. It does stuff. You go pew pew pew. But another thing that is a problem is that Riot at the same time added items called Warden's Mail, and the items that build out of that reduce your hits by a flat amount now. Before, there was no flat reductions, not on a champion's kit like a Mumu. His E reduces a flat amount off a physical damage per physical damage, like 15, I think, at max range or something like that. I could be a little bit wrong. Now, every tank can get a flat amount of damage off auto attacks. When you're shifting the ADC role to be more of a pew 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 rather than a bang bang champion, if that makes sense, like small fast attacks, slower bigger attacks, flat damage reduction hurts them immeasurably. That's why even though the tank role, which I can do a video on after this as well, this video is kind of rambling, I know. It's my first one. I apologize. It will get better with time. But if I do another video on the tank role, I can show how the flat damage reductions is far more powerful on a low AD high attack speed role that ADCs are becoming. Similarly with the high attack speed role, the more attack speed you have, the more incentivized you are for staying in someone's range for a longer period of time. Kind of. For example, if you have one attack every 10 seconds, this is like extreme example. If you have one attack every 10 seconds, you can throw that attack at somebody and then run the fuck away for 9.5 seconds until you go back and do it again. But if you have, for example, 10 attacks a second, you have to be in their range 10 times per second to get off all your damage. And that is far less safe. It is much harder to kite because there's less running animation between your auto attacks. And overall, it makes the ADC role much less safe and much more difficult to play, and also does less damage in the current system. That's a problem. But yeah, before I keep rambling, I just want to say that this is how the ADC role gets kind of tragic right now. You can't really get the same damage numbers. You're spending more on stats that you don't want. You're getting AD, you're getting substantially less AD, which all your abilities scale off. You're paying more for actives and passives and things like that, like Mortal Reminder. Overall, it's a much nerfed role when everything else in the game feels like it was buffed.